At first, it might seem a bit risky to entrust the most important artifact of the War of the Ring to a 4-feet little guy. But the reality is that Frodo's position is not just a decision of the Council, but rather the result of a great divine plan that brought the ring to the Hobbits, starting with Bilbo Baggins and ending with Frodo, as Gandalf himself confirms. Bilbo was meant to find the ring, in which case you also were meant to have it. So in today's video, we'll explore why the Hobbits were chosen to carry Sauron's ring. Alright, to begin this analysis, it's important to clarify a fundamental question about the story of The Lord of the Rings, which is, were Bilbo and Frodo purposefully chosen to receive the ring? And the answer is yes, because they did not become ring bearers merely by a random coincidence. No. At the beginning of The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf tells Frodo the story of Sauron, and calls upon him to be the new bearer of the One Ring. And as an incentive to accept the mission, Gandalf argues that Frodo and Bilbo had been intentionally chosen to receive the ring, recalling the past events of The Hobbit, when Bilbo found the ring. Behind that, there was something else at work, beyond any design of the ring maker. I can put it no plainer than by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker, in which case you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. So notice how, in this passage, Gandalf suggests that Bilbo's encounter with the ring was guided by some higher influence, one that was greater even than Sauron himself, and therefore this same influence also led Frodo to carry the ring in the future, given how the story develops. So considering all of that, we can confirm that Bilbo and Frodo were indeed chosen by a higher authority to bear the One Ring, as Gandalf explains. But moving ahead, this plot point raises another question, which is, what was this influence that guided the Hobbits? Well, in the history of the Legendarium, the world of Arda was conceived by the creator god, Eru Ilúvatar, and in this process, he was aided by the Ainur, who were primordial spirits with power to shape the development of the world. For example, both Sauron and Gandalf shared the same origins as Ainur, being spirits that are called Maiar, and it is because of this spiritual nature that they have a naturally elevated level of power. So, considering that the Hobbits were guided by something beyond Sauron himself, the narrative points toward the creator Eru Ilúvatar as the higher power shaping the fate of Bilbo and Frodo, since Eru's authority stood above Sauron and the other Ainur. A very important point about this divine influence in the Hobbit's fate is that it didn't just manifest out of thin air, with the god going directly to Arda to pull strings. In fact, we know that part of this influence was carried out by agents of higher designs. In this case, Gandalf, who was sent to Middle-earth precisely to guide the Free Peoples during the War of the Ring. If we go back to this book, The Unfinished Tales, there is a pretty interesting dialogue between Gandalf and the other members of the Fellowship of the Ring, which takes place after the end of the war and Aragorn's coronation, when Middle-earth was already free of Sauron. In this conversation, Gandalf explains how he had the intuition to call upon the Hobbits for the journey against evil in Middle-earth. He recounts that, before the events of The Hobbit, he was growing concerned about the growing threat posed by two enemies, Sauron and Smaug, if they ended up acting together against the Free Peoples. So, in order to confront Smaug and get rid of the problem, Gandalf planned to join Thorin Oakenshield's company of dwarves, because of course they were the most qualified team for such a task. And it was while planning this mission that Gandalf had the premonition to invite a hobbit to the party, as he describes. I knew in my heart that Bilbo must go with him, or the whole quest would be a failure. Or, as I should say now, the far more important events, by the way, would not come to pass. So I still had to persuade Thorin to take him. So we can see how the Hobbit's destiny was shaped by a chain of events, which began with a divine influence, which then led to Gandalf's intuition regarding the Hobbits. And it was through this sequence of events that Bilbo and Frodo were ultimately guided to their roles as ring bearers. But this is only part of the answers we're looking for, because it explains how Bilbo and Frodo were guided toward the ring, but not why they specifically were chosen to bear it. So to answer that, we need to take a closer look at the qualities that made them uniquely suited for such a role. The very existence of a divine intervention in the Hobbit's journey highlights just how difficult Frodo's mission truly was, since even the higher powers ended up being involved in the campaign to defeat Sauron. To contextualize the scenario, Frodo's mission consisted of carrying the One Ring from the Shire to Mount Doom, where it could be destroyed. And since the journey from Rivendell to Mordor would take months to complete, much of the expectation placed on Frodo as the great ring-bearer would be his resistance against the ring's power, which he would have to maintain throughout his entire journey, not to mention the final 5 minutes, of course. Therefore, in order for us to understand the role destined for the Hobbits, especially Frodo, it is essential that we first understand what the powers of the One Ring were, and how it affected the living beings of Middle-earth. As explained in one of Tolkien's own letters, Sauron's main goal was to achieve absolute temporal power over the whole world, and it was based on this goal that he developed a new secret plan to create the Rings of Power, which began back in the Second Age of Middle-earth. At that time, Sauron influenced the elves of the region of Eregion to create the Rings of Power, a series of artifacts that could grant the power of preservation. But at the same time, Sauron secretly forged the One Ring, which could corrupt the bearers of the Rings of Power, a scheme that Sauron planned to use to expand his dominion over the world. In this book right here, that contains several letters written by Tolkien, in one of the letters, Tolkien himself explains how all the Rings of Power shared two common abilities, which were as follows. The chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay, changed viewed as a regrettable thing, the preservation of what is desired or loved, or its semblance. This is more or less an elvish motive, but also they enhanced the natural powers of a possessor, a motive easily corruptible into evil, a lust for domination. So the powers of preservation and the enhancement of powers are some of the ring's main capabilities. But what is also very important in this passage is the emphasis on the corruptible tendencies caused by the ring, which is one of the most dangerous properties of the One Ring. So let's take a closer look at how the corruption of the One Ring works. At the beginning of the Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf tells Frodo the story behind the One Ring, explaining how it was extremely powerful and decisive for the future of Middle-earth. In response, Frodo becomes fearful of the power of evil, and he ends up offering the ring to Gandalf as a way to get rid of the whole thing. But since Gandalf knew the dangers surrounding the ring, he rejects the offer, explaining that the ring's corruption begins with an offer of power to its bearer. Do not tempt me, for I do not wish to become like the Dark Lord himself. Yet, the way of the ring to my heart is by pity, pity for weakness and the desire of strength to do good. Do not tempt me, I dare not take it, not even to keep it safe, unused. The wish to wield it would be too great for my strength. I shall have such need of it. Great perils lie before me. What is especially significant in this passage is the way Gandalf acknowledges that is his own desire for power that would lead him to use the ring, which, consequently, would cause him to become corrupted just like Sauron. It turns out that the progressive use of the ring has the effect of corrupting intentions. So, no matter how altruistic Gandalf's motivation may be to defend Middle-earth, the use of the ring would distort his actions, which in the end would be basically replacing one Dark Lord for another. But on the other hand, Gandalf allows the ring to remain in Frodo's possession, because compared to him, the Hobbit has far less innate power, which leads him to naturally place little purpose on power itself. So much so that, in this passage, Frodo wants to rid himself of the ring, which shows how he can partially resist the ring's temptation. So, to summarize the ring's properties, we can see that the temptation projected by the ring relies heavily on two elements: the desire for power and the pursuit of ambition, two feelings that may begin with good intentions, but still end in a cycle of corruption. And additionally, this debate between Gandalf and Frodo is also quite important for introducing one of the reasons that explain why Frodo and Bilbo were chosen to carry the ring, which is the fact that they are both detached from the pursuit of power, a point we'll discuss in more detail later on. The introduction that Gandalf presents about the ring is really important to allow both Frodo and the reader to understand the gravity of Sauron's threat. And at the same time, this development is also essential to explain why Gandalf turned to the race of hobbits to find the two main bearers of the One Ring. So let's see what led the most important mission of Middle-earth to end up in the Shire. It's fair to say that much of what enables Bilbo and Frodo to resist the ring for so long can be traced to their detachment from ambition, which is an attribute that is fostered by the culture of the Hobbits. It happens that Hobbits are known for their simple and peaceful way of life, prioritizing the tranquility of the countryside. With this sustainable way of life, the Hobbits can enjoy a state of fulfillment, finding true well-being in what surrounds them: well-tended land, good food, and some parties here and there. And this Hobbit way of life has led them to be part of a culture that is detached from greed, as Tolkien himself explains in one of his letters. They, the Hobbits, are entirely without non-human powers, but are represented as being more in touch with nature, the soil and other living things, plants and animals, and abnormally, for humans, free from ambition or greed of wealth. There is a passage in The Return of the King that shows a great example of the values behind the culture of the Hobbits, which can be seen when Sam faces the temptations of the One Ring. After Frodo is captured by the orcs, Sam is left alone with the ring, and the book describes how the ring was triggering visions to him. Already, the ring tempted him, gnawing at his will and reason. Wild fantasies arose in his mind, and he saw Samwise the Strong, hero of the age, striding with a flaming sword across the darkened land. Notice how in this part, the ring offers to Sam an offer of power, which is exactly what he might need to save Frodo from the orcs. But even in a moment when he needs strength, Sam is able to resist this influence through memories of his own life experiences as a hobbit, but also, deep down in him, lived still unconquered his plain hobbit sense. He knew in the core of his heart that he was not large enough to bear such a burden, even if such visions were not a mere cheat to betray him. The one small garden of a free gardener was all his need and due, not a garden swollen to a realm. His own hands to use, not the hands of others to command. So when Sam faces the ring's temptation of power, it's his memory of his role as a gardener that helps him to resist, because his hobbit sense is based on a simple and rural culture that is naturally detached from deep ambitions. So, with one more example, the detachment from ambition can also be added to the list of reasons that justify the choice of the two hobbits as ring bearers, due to the way they embody the hobbit mindset. Alright, now we have fully investigated what gives the hobbits a series of advantages against the forces of evil. But among all of the hobbits, specifically Bilbo and Frodo were still chosen to carry the ring. So now let's take a look at what made the Bagginses different from other hobbits. And there's plenty of evidence. They were basically seen as two weirdos in the Shire. But they're good guys. Let's go back to the book Unfinished Tales, to that same conversation we saw a bit ago between Gandalf and other members of the Fellowship. In this passage, Gandalf recalls a time when he was planning his mission to face Smaug, the dragon, alongside Thorin Oakenshield's company of dwarves. And Gandalf explains that the hobbits had two central characteristics that led him to consider the people of the Shire as allies. Well, here is an enemy of Smaug at any rate, and one worthy of help. I must do what I can. I should have thought of dwarves before. And then there was the Shire folk. I began to have a warm place in my heart for them in the long winter, which none of you can remember. They were very hard put to it then. One of the worst pinches they have been in, dying of cold and starving in the dreadful dearth that followed. But that was the time to see their courage and their pity one for another. It was by their pity, as much as by their tough, uncomplaining courage, that they survived. In this section, we can see how Gandalf highlights two key virtues, courage and pity, as decisive factors in the Hobbit's survival during difficult times. And this insight is very important, because it is precisely these qualities that made Bilbo and Frodo stand out from the other hobbits in Gandalf's eyes. Let's start by focusing on how the narrative highlights the hobbits' courage in their adventures. In Bilbo's case, when everything started, he met Gandalf when he was still very young, and from an early age, he already showed an eager interest in the outside world, asking Gandalf about hobbit ancestors who dared to venture beyond the Shire. And this inclination of Bilbo had a rather peculiar effect in his life, compared to other hobbits, which was the fact that he didn't put down roots in the Shire, such as through marriage and a family. So, while it was common for hobbits to settle down in their own land, Bilbo remained unattached, which demonstrated his ambition to experience the outside world. Gandalf recounts this part of Bilbo's past in the continuation of that same conversation from Unfinished Tales. So naturally thinking over the hobbits I knew, I said to myself, I want a dash of the Took, but not too much, Master Peregrine. And I want a good foundation of the Stollider sword, a Baggins perhaps. That pointed at once to Bilbo. No, I guess that he wanted to remain unattached for some reason, deep down, which he did not understand himself, or would not acknowledge, for it alarmed him. He wanted, all the same, to be free to go when the chains came, or he had made up his courage. So the virtue of courage is highlighted once again, this time with Gandalf commenting on how he recognized it in Bilbo, in a way that made him stand out as a unique candidate to venture through Middle-earth. Several years after Bilbo's adventure, it was time for his nephew, Frodo, to take up the mantle of bearer of the One Ring. And part of what led to Frodo being chosen for this position was precisely the influence he received from Bilbo, which ended up shaping in him traits very similar to his uncle's. Since Frodo was raised by Bilbo, he learned from his uncle how to have that same adventurous curiosity about the world outside of the Shire. He often explored regions far from home, wandered about unknown lands, and sought to encounter beings from outside the Shire. So for years, Frodo nurtured a dormant desire to venture through Middle-earth, which also made him, like Bilbo, somewhat unattached, without putting down roots and free for future adventures. Sometime before Frodo was called upon for his journey, we can see some of his traits being described in the book as follows. Frodo began to feel restless, and the old paths seemed too well trodden. He looked at maps and wondered what lay beyond their edges. Maps made in the Shire showed mostly white spaces beyond its borders. He took to wandering further afield, and more often by himself. So this adventurous side of Frodo made him the ideal candidate to take over Bilbo's role as the new hobbit who would inherit the mission against evil. In Frodo's case, his courage plays a fundamental role in his character arc, because as a hobbit, he develops a different kind of virtue than what is seen in many of his allies. Throughout the narrative of The Lord of the Rings, several characters embody what we can see as the virtues of combative heroism, whether by defeating a Balrog, commanding armies, or defeating entire hordes of enemies. But on the other hand, Frodo completes his entire dramatic arc without killing a single orc, because he's portrayed as a different kind of hero. For example, when the Hobbits are surrounded by the Nazgûl at Weathertop, Frodo knows he doesn't have the strength to defeat the Black Riders. But even though he's afraid, he doesn't hand over the ring and even takes the initiative to strike the Witch King, which destabilizes the enemy. So Frodo wasn't just saved by his stronger companions, because it was his own individual actions that prevented the Nazgûl from taking the ring. After this fight, when Frodo recalls the moment, he and Gandalf have the following conversation, in which he explains his feeling regarding it. "Thank goodness I didn't realize the horrible danger," said Frodo faintly. "I was mortally afraid, of course, but if I had known more, I wouldn't have dared even to move. It's a marvel that I escaped." "Yes, fortune or fate have helped you," said Gandalf. "Not to mention courage, for your heart was not touched and only your shoulder was pierced, and that was because you resisted to the last." So, while Frodo admits his fear of facing a stronger enemy, Gandalf again highlights how his courage was the key to overcoming the crisis. So rather than prioritizing the heroism in combat, Frodo demonstrates his worth through courage, being willing to face challenges far greater than himself. Frodo had the bravery to accept his mission, faced the Nazgûl, attacked a giant troll to protect his allies, and even invaded the heart of the enemy's domain. And it is these examples, among many more, that prove all the courage Gandalf saw in the Hobbits. So now we can update further the list of reasons behind the choice of the Hobbits with one more factor, the attribute of having the spark of courage, which, as we have seen, was essential to the success of the entire mission. Beyond their bravery, Gandalf also saw another defining trait of the people of the Shire, which was the pity they showed in times of crisis, as happens at key moments in Bilbo and Frodo's story. Starting with Bilbo, during the events of The Hobbit, he ends up alone in the Misty Mountains, where he finds the One Ring, and also Gollum, who was the former ring-bearer. In this part, Gollum is presented as an antagonist with an aggressive nature, as he's described hunting in the mountains and feeding on other creatures, including even orcs. And this danger also reaches Bilbo, since during his riddle game with Gollum, Gollum weirdly, openly admits that he intends to eat him if he wins. Well, it turns out that Bilbo wins the riddle contest and keeps the One Ring. But since Gollum had already become attached to the ring, he plans to attack Bilbo before he escapes to reclaim his precious. And at this point, the narrative places Bilbo in a dilemma where he must decide between aggression or compassion regarding the tragic state Gollum was in. Bilbo almost stopped breathing and went stiff himself. He was desperate. He must get away out of this horrible darkness. While he had any strength left, he must fight. He must stab the foul thing, but its eyes out. Kill it. It meant to kill him. No, not a fair fight. He was invisible now. Gollum had no sword. Gollum had not actually threatened to kill him, or tried to yet, and he was miserable, alone, lost. A sudden understanding, a pity mixed with horror, welled up in Bilbo's heart. A glimpse of endless unmarked days without light or hope or betterment. Hard stone, cold fish, sneaking and whispering. All these thoughts passed in a flash of a second. He trembled, and then quite suddenly, in another flash, as if lifted by a new strength and resolve, he leaped. In this passage, Bilbo undergoes a type of incremental change, starting with fear, which leads him toward aggression. But as he considers Gollum's condition, unarmed and alone, he controls his impulse and escapes without attacking the creature, which marks a test of Bilbo's virtue in the face of a moral dilemma. Well, many years after the events of The Hobbit, as we know, the dilemma that Bilbo faced in the past returned as a new conflict, when Gollum reappears as a key figure in The Lord of the Rings. Early in the story, Gandalf reveals that Sauron's forces captured Gollum, and discover that the One Ring had been taken to the Shire, which put a big target on the Hobbits' location. So when Frodo discovered that the Shire had been put at risk because of Gollum, he condemned the creature, judging him unworthy of life. However, Gandalf presents a very important counterpoint to this lack of mercy after Frodo says the following. I can't understand you. Do you mean to say that you and the elves have let him live on after all those horrible deeds? Now, at any rate, he's as bad as an orc, and just an enemy. He deserves death. Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death in judgment, for even the very wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he's bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many, yours not least. The narrative isn't really trying to be subtle here, and the text is quite clear about the point it is making. Frodo is morally wrong to condemn Gollum's life, and he needs to reconsider this point of view, because the salvation of Middle-earth may lie precisely in pity, as Bilbo did. In the past, Bilbo had to free himself from anger to act with pity, which ensured his protection against the ring, and in the future, Frodo must face the same challenge regarding the same character, because he will also need to be protected from the ring's influence when it tries to take hold of him. So right at the beginning of the story, Frodo is already placed in a dilemma that will accompany his entire dramatic arc, proving that he can act with mercy, which is a conflict that unfolds precisely in the relationship between Frodo and Gollum. So let's revisit some of the key points of this lovely friendship. After the Fellowship of the Ring splits up, the book The Two Towers follows Frodo and Sam traveling toward Mordor, and in this part of the journey, Gollum approaches them after spending days tracking Frodo's trail. When the hobbits finally approach Gollum for the first time, they catch a glimpse of him during an internal conflict, where he declares his intention to reclaim the ring. And right after that, this interaction ends in a big fight, with Frodo having to draw Sting to keep everything under control. And it's at this point that he faces a decisive choice for his arc, when Frodo must choose between aggression and pity in his conduct. Early in the journey, Gandalf had already pointed out that Frodo should not renounce his empathy, highlighting this conflict in the story. And now, following Gollum's introduction, Frodo's dilemma returns stronger than ever, given how Gollum is presented as a threat to both him and his mission to save the world. So, to make the morally correct decision, Frodo must show mercy in the face of a potential threat, which further challenges his sense of compassion. But in the end of this dilemma, he recalls Gandalf's words and makes the right choice. Very well, he answered aloud, lowering his sword. But still I am afraid, and yet, as you see, I will not touch the creature, for now that I see him, I do pity him. Sam stared at his master, who seemed to be speaking to someone who was not there. Gollum lifted his head. Yes, wretched we are, precious, he whined. Misery, misery! Hobbits won't kill us. Nice hobbits. What makes Frodo bound with Gollum so central to the story is that it isn't just defined by a single test, like he could simply spare Gollum's life once and consider the whole conflict resolved. No, it's not that simple. Instead, Frodo's growth is shaped by continually reaffirming his pity for Gollum, which demonstrates the genuineness of his virtues. There's a good example of this dynamic in the passage where Faramir and his group of rangers encounter Gollum trespassing at the Forbidden Pool, when they consider killing him since Gollum had breached a secret location. But in response, Frodo interferes to protect Gollum, taking responsibility for his actions and risking his own life by stepping into the range of the main aim. "Shall we shoot?" said Faramir, turning quickly to Frodo. Frodo did not answer for a moment. "Then no," he said. "No, I beg you not to." If Sam had dared, he would have said yes, quicker and louder. He could not see, but he guessed well enough from their words what they were looking at. Notice that in this part, the text states that Sam would have accepted the attack, while Frodo begs them not to shoot, which forms a contrast between the two hobbits. So the conflict highlights how Frodo has a distinct level of compassion for Gollum, even compared to another hobbit. In the final part of the journey, Frodo ends up being overpowered by the influence of the ring, since in the heart of Mount Doom, Sauron's power was impossible for anyone to resist. But even under the ring's influence, Frodo was able to fulfill his role as the ring bearer, precisely because of the mercy he chose to show throughout the journey. When Frodo succumbs to Sauron's power, it is Gollum's final charge that carries the ring to its destruction in the fire. Therefore, only because Gollum was saved by Frodo could the world be saved from the ring. Regarding Frodo's final struggle, Tolkien himself explains that. But at this point, the salvation of the world, and Frodo's own salvation, is achieved by his previous pity and forgiveness of injury. At any point, any prudent person would have told Frodo that Gollum would certainly betray him. To pity him, to forbear to kill him, was a piece of folly, or a mystical belief in the ultimate value in itself of pity and generosity, even if disastrous in the world of time. Finally, after revisiting all of these moments from the War of the Ring, we can see what made the Hobbit so crucial to the victories of the Free People in the conflicts of Middle-earth. So, to conclude our list with a final addition, the fact that both Bilbo and Frodo acted on pity is yet another reason that supports their roles as ring-bearers, reinforcing a key virtue they developed to complete their mission and save Middle-earth. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this journey regarding everything that made the Hobbit so special compared to other characters, and thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please feel free to leave a like, and I invite you as well to subscribe if you are into this kind of stuff. Alright, thank you very much, I appreciate it, and see you next time.